but also we wanted to talk about these ideas more broadly. And so for the next hour, it gives me great pleasure to have a conversation with two significant policy influencers and then also two significant practitioners. So for the first half of this In Conversation, I welcome Executive Director Offender Development at the Department of Correctional Services, Vanessa Swan, and I also welcome Director of the Office for Women, Fiona Mort. So thank you very much for your time. So for the... I wanted to use this opportunity to have a conversation with both Fiona and Vanessa about, men's behaviour change, the men's intervention space, and how we think about that at a policy context, and what we need to consider when thinking about it at a policy context, not just at a practice context. I might just open up with you, Vanessa, if that's okay. If you could give us an overview of the programs offered for men who use violence in intimate partner relationships here in this state, or more broadly as well.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Can people hear me with my mic? Good. Yeah. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Dharma Land and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. So my position is at the Department of Correctional Services, as Sarah said. So I'm going to speak about correctional services in the very far tertiary end of what we do in South Australia rather than more broadly. As people will know, that over the last probably 5 to 10 years there's been an enormous increase in incarceration rates broadly, and in fact in South Australia, and I'm going to look at some notes, so apologies for me looking down at times, but there's some figures I want to give you. So over the past 10 years, the national average growth in incarceration has been 47% across Australia. In South Australia, we've managed to have a percentage increase of 86%. So we incarcerate enormous numbers of people broadly. So this is not just about DV, this is about a whole range of different things. And people will note that some years ago we had a government that were very keen, and there's some memorable quotes in regard to Rackham, Packham and Stackham, which was really a direction policy-wise that South Australia has embarked upon. So it's important to know that that's the context. And we also have a particular and interesting experiment going on at the moment in South Australia, but more broadly, where the very good work that many of us, and probably all of you in this room, have participated in, which is raising the significance and importance of the issue of domestic and family violence, and really having a society that now acknowledges that as a problem and a serious issue that we must do something about to reduce. One of the impacts is that we have changed some laws, we've changed policing activity, and we have ended up incarcerating large numbers of people for domestic and family violence. Now, at this point, and I am going wide, we don't know with this experiment whether punitive incarceration in and of itself will reduce reoffence rates. And that would be just pointing, as all good research does, to research projects that may be worthy of doing in the future, is to look at what will the impact be of incarcerating men for offences associated with domestic violence. Will that reduce the rate of incarceration? Now, we have got some indicators around that, in that we know in terms of gender violence and other forms of violence that punitive incarceration in and of itself, so punishment in and of itself, does not reduce recidivism. We know that. That's factual. There's good, large quantitative studies that indicate that. However, if we then provide good rehabilitation, good methods of engaging people in other activities as well, in terms of, and I'll speak to general offending rather than DV, but for example, addressing homelessness, looking at vocational pathways, literacy and numeracy, addressing cognitive deficits. If we do some of that work as well as incarcerating people, we can reduce recidivism. So we know that. We also know from general violence programs, and these are programs that have very good international, quantitative, large population size, statistical validity, that certain forms of risk-need responsivity work, which is a particular form of narrative, but other form of approach in CBT will, particular groups with a particular intensity will reduce recidivism for general offenders, right? We don't know that. We don't know that in regard to domestic and family violence. So again, I'm just pointing at areas that I think we need to be thinking about in this tertiary sector. And Fiona's going to talk about the more general sort of policy context, so go to prevention and other sorts of issues that we must do. So I'm not trying to say that this work is more important than that work, because we're always, you know, we have a limited dollar to spend on these things, so we have to work out what is best to do. But I will also say that incarceration is an incredibly expensive approach to dealing with problems. So in a high security environment, a person for a year costs about $100,000. If we then add on top of that the cost of courts, the cost of policing, the impact on families, it's a very, very expensive approach to dealing with this. And I remember many years ago, in my more naive days, working in the women's sector, in rape and sexual assault in particular, and I didn't think at that point, when my focus was victims, my solution was very much lock them up, put them away, stop them doing this harm. But what I've come to realise working in corrections is that that's not an end point. There's a tiny handful, probably under 10 people in South Australia, that we're never going to release. The rest of the population that we have there, we do release. So we release over, murder, maybe 20 years, domestic violence, maybe, I don't know, I'm guessing this, I don't know the data, but I'd say 2 to 3 years, but they come back very often. But it's not, it's not a final solution. It's not a solution. It's a costly, expensive way of continuously dealing with people. So back to programs, which is really your question, and I will perhaps try and be a bit shorter in my answer. Sorry. So what we do have a domestic and family violence intervention program, and I want to acknowledge Greg Bullock, who's sitting over there, and Tony Fletcher and Alicia Sapoka, who's over there. So we've got people who've actually, certainly Greg is the manager of the team that deliver this program in the community and in our prison system. So they know a whole lot more about this than me. So I'll look to them if I say things are incorrect. But at the moment, this program's been running since about 2016. So we developed this program, like all of us. We've got this group of people who commit these offences, and we need to do something about it. We feel as a society we should, and I certainly support that. And we're still trying to figure out, and this research that we're talking about today is part of that, what is the best approach to use that's going to be most effective. So in developing this program, the program's based on feminist principles. So the socio-political context of the narrative work that's been talked about today, it involves some narrative techniques and approaches. It also has elements of the Duluth approach, but not necessarily so much the very kind of punitive approach that some elements of Duluth talk about. It has some CBT techniques. It's 20 weeks. The four key principles of the approach is safety, accountability, responsibility, and respect. And we do this work in partnership with the Women's Safety Service South Australia, and Megan Hughes is over there and some other members of the Women's Safety Service, our partners in this. So we employ them to engage with the partners and ex-partners of the men that we're working with. So that's
Thank you very much for that overview, Vanessa. It's important to hear it both at the tertiary end and also to continue to raise questions about what is the most appropriate response to men who use violence. It's a complex question to actually answer. But I do want to now turn to Fiona, because Fiona's Director for the Office for Women, and I particularly wanted to ask Fiona the question of why it's important that a department such as the Office for Women is actually included in broader decision making and planning around watches or programs offered for men who use violence in their intimate partner relationships.
Thanks, Sarah. That's a big question. And also, I just want to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on Ghana land and pay my respects to elders past and present and commitment to emerging leaders and to work with them. In terms of I think it's when you talk about women's safety, when you talk about women's voices, then there's a natural place for the Office for Women to fit in that. I think the other aspect for us in South Australia is that we're actually the policy lead around violence against women work, so we coordinate and monitor the activities of all of our government departments, including my partner and colleague there, Vanessa's work in the Department for Correctional Services. But I think there's something more. I think it goes more to the question of the role of women's services more broadly, not just the Office for Women. Obviously, what's been touched on this morning is the important role of the victim/woman's experience, whether she's a current partner or an ex-partner. But there are women we know that actually don't want to participate. They just want to go on, get on with their lives and say goodbye. So therefore, how do you actually ensure that that voice, that perspective is brought in to the actual conversations? And, in my very early social work career, I'm not going to say how long ago it was, but, it was a long time ago. Some of that was about recognising the men that use violence are incredibly often charismatic, manipulative. They've been using violence for a long time. So they've got a whole range of tactics, and sometimes there's the ability for workers who are working with men to see their truth as the only truth and operate from that. And unless we have that balancing in terms of the experience of their partners, their ex-partners, their community members, we won't actually know exactly where things are at and could be actually adding to the difficulties that a woman is experiencing. I think the other aspect is we know that men who use violence go on to repartner. So even if she is no longer in the picture, the woman that's actually been the reason for the engagement with a service or an intervention, we need to actually look at how we actually ensure that we're continuing to actually assess what's going on for other women in his life. So new partners often may not, the evidence suggests they're not aware of what's going on or what has gone on in the past. We certainly, as a South Australian government, have got a domestic violence disclosure scheme that is going through a trial to the middle of next year, which is the intent to actually provide an opportunity to gather information if women or family members or friends of women are unsure of what's going on and they're starting to see some concerning behaviours. And that's one of the very, there needs to be more mechanisms, but it's one mechanism to actually ascertain whether there's been a history and whether there's been past victims that he's partnered with. So I think there's a key role for women's services. I think the concern when programs started 20, 30 years ago was just working with the men, and I think the evidence and the research and the feedback from partners and a whole range of services, including practitioners such as yourself, was to say we need to have a very strong place for the voices of the victims, the voices of women, and to continue that voice throughout the intervention and also post the intervention. And therefore, in a policy setting, it's really important to have that women's policy voice throughout and to have the conversations that we have regularly about what does it mean for a woman whose partner or ex-partner is involved in an intervention. What does it mean, Vanessa's comments about the custodial setting and the incarceration rates. What does that mean for women and victims now and in the future? And, one example of that is the importance within that voice of Aboriginal women in terms of the incarceration rates. We know the massively over-representation of Aboriginal men, Aboriginal women in our prisons and in our custodial interventions. We need to look at that as a system to see what's actually happening, because it's not about them being Aboriginal. Something is actually in essence going awry in the way we're actually assessing things. And that was a very long-winded question.
No.
Answer to a question.
Yeah,
sorry.
and I think, Fiona, what you've particularly highlighted is, just some of those important points that when you have a practice approach like invitational or narrative ways of working who strive to capture the women's voice, you need to have that mirrored at a higher level in policy. And I think you pointed that out quite well in terms of how we might partner with agencies to enable that to happen, but also how you think about that more broadly at a government or a policy response about how you emanate the capturing of women's experiences at that policy level. And you can see that through examples like the funding of women's contact programs or the funding of a disclosure scheme. So I was so kind of like taking those kind of points that you've summarised around, you know, from your point of view being the major considerations for your office or being an influencer in policy. I might then turn to Vanessa. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Vanessa, about that conversation, but particularly, you know, the major considerations for you in terms of investing in and funding programs that enable men's behaviour and attitudinal change?
So I think one of the issues which I mentioned before is cost. So the cost of programs and the cost to the community. You know, if we spend money incarcerating men, then we're not, you know, spending money on housing for homeless, we're not spending healthcare dollars. You know, a society has a finite amount that is to be spent. And so I'm very mindful, and I think Fiona would agree, but that we're very mindful that we are trying to make the best decisions with a small bucket of money. And so I guess we're also, the detail's really critical, and we're still in such early days with domestic violence work with perpetrators, in that we don't, it's some of the detail that's really important. So, for example, with the 11 men in this study, you know, some up to 2 years of one-to-one therapy. Now, that's not a model that we could use in corrections. It's just not. Like, it's the cost of that on top of incarceration, on top of all that we do. It's just not a viable model. So we really need to come back and go, well, and I'm very aware I'm using medical language because it's useful, but it's not because I think in those terms. But what is the dosage? What is at what point, you know, how much is needed and what's the least amount that's effective? You know, it's those kinds of questions that I think we really need to get to. Is it possible to do some of this in a group? You know, what part can we do in a group? What part's one-to-one? You know, if you talk in this model, there's quite an emphasis on engagement. Now, we know from broader work, not narrative work in particular, but broader work, that engagement of therapist or facilitator with the person is really absolutely critical in terms of change. And so we need to know what are the elements. So again, if I go to our general violence work, so we know in that work that for people who don't have a cognitive impairment, something like 9 months of about 3 sessions a week with some one-to-one sessions is the amount necessary to engage. If people have a cognitive impairment, that's 18 months, that's double that. So we know that that's the amount that will work. So we are, and again, this is not published, but something that I can speak about, but we're really critically, what we also know, probably is another backdrop to this, is something is not better than nothing, right? So we're in territory where there's risks. So there's some intervention that will cause more harm. So we can't just go, well, it's better than nothing, because we may be making it worse. So we have to know some of the outcome stuff to know. So examples of things that make it worse are boot camp. You know, the notion, and again, people follow logic. So we're following logic. If it's socio-political and you do this, this makes sense, so this addresses the wider social. So that's a logic, but we've got to, and it kind of makes sense to me, that's my politic, but I'm a feminist, that's my politic, but we've got to know whether it works. We also know that, so we know that certain sorts of interventions are harmful. We also know that some programs, if you only do half a program, people are more dangerous than if they did none. So we have, I don't know about this work, but we know that with other work. So we need to get into the detail of this in ways that we haven't as yet to know what is helpful. So we talk about, in this work, shame, and so people who, you know, demonstrate remorse and shame. Now, there's interesting and controversial work in that space as well. So we know, for example, for general offenders, shame, remorse is not an indication that they will be less likely to reoffend. That doesn't work like that. Now, we think it might in this space, but do we know that? So again, we need to, quantitative, let's see 5-year follow-ups, who's doing less, let's see this, let's know this. They're the questions that, for me, as someone looking to future programs. Now, having said that, we do have our programs because we think we can't not be part of this conversation. We are doing, because with our groups where we have got evidence about what works, the issue about what works is, are we doing it right, that we are getting the same results of the literature? We can't assume that how we do it is effective, given it's so precise. It's particular precision that's necessary to get those results. So we video sessions, we review them. We're doing up to 5-year follow-up of a matched control. We're doing risk assessments. What is the risk level? Compare someone who's high risk with someone else who's high risk who didn't get the program. Follow them for 5 years. Do large quantitative and figure out are our groups working. Now, we've got tentative good results for our general violence prevention programs up to 5 years post release. For our domestic and family violence, again, I have permission to talk about today, but it's still very much in-house work we're doing. We have some promising results for our matched group, but it's early stages and the numbers are too small to generalise. But we need to do that to then be able to demonstrate. So they're the kinds of things that are really important to me as a funder and a manager in this space.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa, for that honesty. Also, and I think what you've also alluded to is that this space we're dealing with really complex issues, men's use of violence. Mm-hmm. And so when you've got that level of complexity, it kind of only makes sense that it's going to take a fair bit of long-term work. Mm-hmm. But also, I think what you've alluded to, and it is quite correct, that in this space we do need more research that looks at the longitudinal outcomes. I don't think we have that really well in Australia at the moment, so that ANROWS to be able to fund and start looking at this research is a good thing. So I'm just a little bit aware of time, and Vanessa's given us some insights about the possibilities but also the challenges of invitational and narrative ways of working. I'm just wondering also, Fiona, if you've got some reflections about, after listening today about what possibilities invitational narrative have to offer, but also what worries you as Director for the Office for Women.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of my concerns is that we don't go down a path that says this is the only way you do the work. People are unique, they've got different backgrounds and different histories, and what works for some is not going to work for everybody. And I think in terms of a research and an evidence base, we are still in the very early days in perpetrator work, but I think we're not necessarily always looking at who aren't we seeing, who aren't we engaging with. And, narrative, and, Sarah and I have had a conversation about this, narrative can be quite reliant on a cognitive reflection, linguistic ability, and therefore what does that mean for people with brain injury, from different cultural backgrounds, etc., where English isn't their first language, for example, are things that we need to consider. I think the other challenge for us is that, Vanessa alluded to it, that we're right in the eye of the storm in terms of the community's support and desire for greater investment in ending violence against women and their children. And in terms of our women's services, we've got quite robust and evidence and certainly robust programs and connected and sort of a whole range and suite of interventions. In a perpetrator space, the predominant intervention still sits in the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. And so part of the work of the office is looking at is trying to look at what do we need pre-statutory, mm-hmm. what do we need, and moving past the primary prevention. There is an absolute role in primary prevention and we need to build that capacity. But it's actually about that earlier intervention. I sort of describe it as a lot of and by intervention I mean more than just programs, and I think that's where we need to sit. The challenge for us is to not see it all as group programs or individual interventions. It's a broader suite that we need, and we need to be looking earlier. Now you can look at the earlier being earlier in the cycle of use of violence, or earlier in the age, earlier in the trajectory of escalation, etc. And there's some of the things that we need to look at, and we need to build, certainly in South Australia, that earlier approach, which
logic and cost imperatives and that may suggest you go down to look with younger men and look at what are the earlier interventions, what are the programs that need to be operating. We've done some work with our youth justice system to look at how we actually intervene, but that may not be the only way. We need to look at things. We don't necessarily have a robust understanding of what works there, and we're not, we've got individual amazing agencies doing work across the state, but we need to connect it up and we need to sort of facilitate it better. We also need to equip our first responders / earlier intervention services such as education, health, community services to identify a perpetrator, because that's not, we did that work 20 years ago now in terms of identifying victims, you know, various, you know, I'm looking at Fiona Buchanan now, who was certainly as part of that, you know, various mechanisms to have our health services identify, particularly in emergency. You know, this woman has had a history. We need to be doing some of that work in terms of this so we can pick up perpetrators of domestic violence much earlier, and we ensure that the interventions that then happens, whether it's to do with their mental health or drug and alcohol behaviour, are actually informed by the fact that they're a perpetrator and they're not actually doing things that could be dangerous to the safety of women and children. And we've had a coronial inquest here a number of years ago, White and White coronial inquest. If you want to go onto the coroner's website, you'll see that the Forensic Mental Health Services didn't view him as a perpetrator of DV. So therefore the practice then compromised, and whether that would have made a difference, we don't know, but certainly the suggestions from the recommendations are that understanding that he was a perpetrator, understanding that her having just given birth to a child is a significantly high-risk time, may have resulted in him not being discharged to her home. So there's those sorts of things that I think. But we're right, everybody wants it all done. We haven't got the evidence. We need to package up our statutory interventions to be based on evidence and robust and post, 5 years. But we've got to build the scaffolding in the primary prevention space around what respect looks like, so that we're not continuing to pick up people after they fall over the cliff is often the metaphor that's used. I think the other challenge for me across the board in intervening with perpetrators is what is the outcome we're looking for? Is the outcome about his change, reducing his recidivism? I would suggest that funders and others would want that. But what about her? Is it about her feeling safer? Is it about her making decisions that are based on reality, not his promises that he'll change if he has an intervention or a program? I don't think we've actually crafted that and navigated that well, or even articulated it well, because when I talk to people in the judiciary, I get the recidivism. Certainly from conversations with parts of government, that's where the focus is. But the nuance is in what we're doing to support her and what we're doing to support the children that are actually living with this experience. And whether we like it or not, if there's children and he's the father of the children, then there will be an ongoing connection into those children forever and a day. So somehow we've got to look at that nuance around what is our evidence that we're looking for.
Yeah. I just want to thank both Vanessa and Fiona for their time this morning to give us an insight into, so not only practice on the ground, but an insight into how we think about men's behaviour and attitudinal change more broadly, particularly in the policy context, but also in how we fund these programs. So thank you very much, both of you, for your honesty and giving us, again, food for thought, but asking those questions, those hard questions with not very easy answers, they need continually to be asked. So can I get you to thank Fiona and Vanessa for their time?